Natalie Samarasinghe is the CEO of the United Nations Association UK. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hello, good morning.
So in the middle of this pandemic, it's easy to get distracted by sideshows like the Brazilian president flaunting his unvaccinated status, apparently proud of it, while his health minister tests positive for COVID, proving to critics this UNGA could very well become a super spreader event. But all this aside, what needs to be achieved when it comes to COVID vaccine equity, and what is actually possible?
I think, it's easy to look at what's happening at the General Assembly as a bit of a sideshow, warm words, etc. But I think the value really that I took from the day yesterday is that the international community is united, at least in its diagnosis of the problem. And I think that is very acutely evident when it comes to vaccine equity. The Secretary General did not mince his words. He evoked a very stark image of, discarded vaccines in bins, whilst 90% of people in Africa are still waiting for their first dose. So I think what we need to see is some very concrete commitments to funding COVAX, to donating vaccines, but also to enabling other countries to produce their own vaccines, removing patents and making this, a global public good, which it needs to be because it's a moral imperative and because it's in our own self-interest. This situation will not end until we get this right.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the other big issue is climate change, and that's already received a lot of attention. As we were talking, China making a major policy shift, focusing on doing its part. But how far will Beijing likely go? And what about other nations when it comes to making concrete commitments?
I think what really struck me from the speeches yesterday was the way in which both China and the US positioned their sort of pitch for power, as it were, around these issues of COVID and climate change. Now, this isn't to say that the traditional, elements of power, military and so on are going away, but I think it's fascinating that this struggle is framed now around actually leadership on those two issues. I think that's actually quite an important step forward. The key, I think, will be whether we can, in both those issues, overcome inequality. So there's a huge divide between those who are bearing the brunt of climate change and those who are historically most responsible, those who have the resources and those who haven't. We've seen these pledges before. Again, can we turn these into some concrete actions in the next 6 weeks? I think that's hugely challenging, but let's hope.
Yeah, indeed. We hold a lot of hope, don't we, with all of this? And US President Joe Biden told the world he favours diplomacy over military might and said America is back. But many people saying, what does that mean exactly, especially in the wake of his new defence pact with the UK and Australia that France calls a breach of trust. And then there's the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan that caught allies by surprise. What are France, European allies and others to make of all this? And can Biden win back that trust that he's clearly lost?
I think he gave it a good go yesterday, but he did not have the hero's welcome that we might have expected him to have had he addressed the General Assembly, 6 months ago. I mean, at a very basic level, it's great to have a US president send these positive signals on diplomacy, give a coherent speech, raise human rights issues, as well as, make some clear commitments on climate and COVID. But I think, the trust really does need to be earned. And the same goes, I think, for the UK as well in the lead up to Glasgow. It is really up to them to use the informal spaces in the General Assembly to reconnect with allies, as well as the sort of theatrical set piece speeches.
And, just to end on that, because, the UNGA and other meetings of global leaders, they're usually lots of talk fests. The difference here is this is happening in the middle of a pandemic, and we talked about those sideshows. In the end, what does get achieved? Very much?
I think there is great value in having a talk shop. I know it's, the criticism people level against the UN, but this is the chance for countries to come together formally and informally to create solutions and resolve their differences. And if they cannot do that, at least they're channeling that energy diplomatically, as opposed to it, conflict and military confrontation. So I think there's that base level value. But I also think if you look particularly at the speech of the Secretary General, this was not an airy-fairy speech. He did a lot more than just sound the alarm. Trump, he laid out some very, very clear policy prescriptions, on everything from COVID to climate, but also governance of the digital space, some of the challenges we need to address for the, future. So I think there is a clear blueprint on what we need to do. The proof will be whether we can muster the political will to get there.
Natalie Samarasinghe, a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.